Hey Maggie, so I have a version of the entire potential speech, obviously a first draft, and I'm going to be relying more heavily on notes than I probably would be, but I just wanted to get out the content of this to you. And I'm also going to be sending you kind of like a summary, pretty long summary of this version, so you'll have something to reference too. Yeah, and I have to like click back and forth between a lot of things because I'm kind of not totally great at figuring out how videos work. And I'll have to stop every 15 minutes because I also only know how to send a video every 15 that's 15 minutes long with this program. But that's gonna work. So yeah. All right, so here we go. Here's what I've got for now. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Cameron Mack, and I'm part of the Active Mind Speakers Bureau. Like you've heard, we're a group of about 10, I don't actually know how many, individuals who travel around the country, and we share our stories about mental health. And today, I share my story because there was a time when I couldn't. I remember I was 14 years old and I had just come back from my first admission into a psychiatric hospital, and some friends asked me, "Hey, where you been?" And I was like, "Oh, I just, I wasn't feeling well. There were some physical things going on." And they were like, "Oh, phew, okay, because we thought you might have been depressed or something." And I was like, "Oh, no, no, definitely me. No, not me." But the truth is, I had been incredibly depressed. There was just so many things that I felt ashamed of then that I couldn't tell them. I couldn't talk about things that were really going on, like the fact that I had grown up in a household where I felt afraid a lot because there was violence and there were times when my voice wasn't heard. And as time went on, I experienced a lot more anxiety and depression. And I couldn't tell these things to my friends. And I definitely couldn't tell them that the reason that I had wound up in that psychiatric unit was because I had attempted suicide. I've actually been able to tell them now that that's what happened, but it wasn't easy. It has taken me a really long time to be able to share my story, and I'm really lucky to be able to be standing here and share it with you because I think it's incredibly important. So during my teenage years, it wasn't just that first hospitalization that happened. I actually spent my entire teenage years in and out of hospitals. And I had no idea what a psychiatric hospital would be like. And when I got there, it was pretty scary. And what they do is they take your things and they go through all of them. And I really love hoodies, and they would always take the strings out of my sweatshirt and be like, "What are you doing?" And I'd get sometimes a roommate, and they had some beds with some pretty scratchy sheets, and I really didn't know what to expect. But what basically happened was there were all sorts of therapy. There was group therapy, recreational therapy, art therapy, individual therapy, everything that's supposed to make me feel better, right? But unfortunately, I was actually not really getting better for a long time. It wasn't until I moved into a group home where, a group of teenagers who are also having struggles were living, that I really started to get my feet back under me. And then from there, I went to live in a foster home in a really supportive, loving house. And that was also really helpful. And I think, one of the pieces that really helped me be able to transition back to things like going to school, which was really challenging because I felt really weird when I went to school. I would be in math class and everyone would be talking about what they were up to and, what they did last night. I felt like all of my stories just started with, so this one time in a psych unit, and I didn't know how people would respond to that kind of story. Looking at the time. Okay. So yeah, I was trying to figure out how to get back into real life after being in the hospital so long and, feeling really different than the rest of my peers. Even though I'm sure other people were going through struggles, but I was so inside my own head, I didn't think about that myself. So I ended up going to college after high school, which was a pretty big deal for me. There used to be a time where I just thought everyone kind of went to college, but high school was so difficult that there was a point where I thought I wouldn't make it. But I did. And college was difficult at first. I had kind of a rough start. I struggled with some depression. But then I was able to get my feet back under me, and I kept going. And I actually had 3.5 years where I wasn't in the hospital at all, which was great because I was doing really well. I was really connected to friends in school, and it was about that time that I started speaking for Active Minds, went around traveling, telling my story. And then something happened. I was in school at that time, which was a lot of stress. I was also going through a breakup that was really stressful. And I got into a really bad depression, one that even despite the best of attempts to be okay, doing things like running or talking with friends, like I was just really, really miserable, and I got to that point where I couldn't get out of bed, and that's kind of when I know I really need help. And I had been reaching out to therapists, and after a while, me and the people important to me in my life decided that I needed to go back to the hospital, which in some ways I thought was, a real failure. But you know what? That's what I needed, and I'm so glad that, I ended up there instead of just having to suffer alone, because that's what could have ended up happening. So I really thought things were going to kind of turn around for me at that point, since I was reaching out to get help, because I was pretty hopeless at the time. But life definitely threw me a curveball at that point, and I continued to have difficulties, and the doctors started calling it rapid cycling bipolar disorder type 1. And this was really scary for me, because basically what would happen is I would spend a few weeks in a really severe depression, and it wasn't usually triggered by anything. It would just appear, and it would feel like someone had just told me that someone had died. I just had that horrible, heavy feeling. And it was impossible to do really simple things like take a shower or, call a friend. I didn't feel very social. So I would spend a couple weeks in this really severe depressed state. Then I would have about a week of what felt like normal mood time. And then my mood would transition into something the doctors called mania. And mania came in 2 kinds of flavors. In the first kind, I would feel amazing. I tell people sometimes that mania is like having 1,000 epiphanies all at the same time, because my mind would just race and I would be able to write really well. But sometimes I would do things that were a little bit risky. Sometimes I felt like I had powers that I didn't really have. For instance, I felt like I could fly during my first manic episode. And I tried to, but luckily I just jumped into the gravel and not from any really high height. It was really scary for the people around me. And so the second flavor of mania is called a mixed state. And during this time, I would have really high energy, and I would have those same racing thoughts, but they would be about more negative things like death and suicide. Usually during those times, I would feel incredibly restless, just, skin is crawling. And during either of the different kinds of mania, I tended to get into more fights with my family and friends, and some people would tell me I was kind of annoying, a little bit hard to be around at times. Sometimes really fun, but other times it was just too much. I had a lot more energy than most people. So yeah, let's see. So with rapid cycling, it was incredibly difficult because it was really hard to maintain things like schoolwork and maintain relationships in my life. So I stopped going to school and I started working because that was a little bit easier in terms of stress. I really tried to keep it together. I was working with doctors. I was trying a bunch of different medications, which some were helpful to some degree and others were really awful. I experienced some pretty intense side effects. There were times when I had pretty severe acne or weight gain. There were times that I was drooling. People would tell me my personality was dulled, and there were some medications that made my anxiety go through the roof. So this was really challenging. And, medication is a tool that a lot of people use to help manage their mental health, and I've learned that that is a tool, but there are also other ways. At this point, the doctors were telling me that they thought that the rapid cycling should have stopped and that they hadn't really heard of many cases where it had gone on this long. So that made me feel really miserable. And it was getting hard to keep my job and keep getting up and going to work when I was just so all over the place mentally. I was really losing hope at that point. So again, with the important people in my life, we decided that, okay, I'm going to stop the video and start another one. So we decided that,